Yeah. So, Joshi, I work for Schneider Electric, and at Schneider, we've been like many other IoT organizations. By the way, show of hands, who here is in the IoT value chain, either creating data, using data, or just curious? There better not be any hand that's not up. No, just kidding. So just like everybody else in this room, we started our journey for digital transformation several years ago, and the obvious thing was with connecting our products. So we took our assets, we sell a lot of energy management kind of solutions, and started connecting them just to get a better insight into how customers are using our products. And the idea was we build products and solutions and offers and new business models to cater to their needs. And lo and behold, we find ourselves sitting on a big stack of data, right? And if the intent of all this exercise really was to create value based on data, then it's all about data preparation. It's about finding the right data in this giant stack of data that we call Tsunami. I was on the flight, by the way, on a red eye this morning, reading something, and the quote from IDC was, I love, by the way, how precise these numbers are. 163, not 60, not 65, 163 zettabytes of data will be generated 2025, right? And that will be generated, replicated, probably replicated again in backups. Think about the tsunami word that we picked for this panel today is truly facing us. So what we have in a panel today is our solution, right? So these guys are going to help us address many topics that we're facing sitting on top of this tsunami wave and saying, okay, so how do I prepare my data? If analytics and AI and machine learning and data marketplaces and data sharing and all these things are opportunities, not challenges, opportunities, positive way to look at it, then how do we leverage technologies? How do we leverage standards? How do we leverage interoperability solutions, et cetera, to meet the solutions, to meet the needs of the market? So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. They each of them have a fascinating story to tell. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. So they've all agreed to share with us a little bit about themselves and their story, their journey, a couple perspectives they've learned in their journey working with IoT data, and then we'll go into the Q&A session. So Melanie, you want to start?
Sure, thanks. Melanie Nuce, Senior Vice President of Corporate Development at GS1 US. GS1 is a global standards organization. We work in information standards, so we're most famously known for the data in the UPC barcode. It's scanned over 5 billion times a day all over the world in a variety of forms, and of course we've worked in supply chain standards for over 40 years. We got involved in the IoT journey really from the perspective that we've been identifying consumer products for 40 years, and we hear a lot of talk in Internet of Things conversations around devices, which generally have a smart function or multiple smart functions to them, and humans who are going to interact with these devices, and wonderful things are going to happen, but nobody wants to talk about the dumb products like the olive oil, the baby formula, the car seat, that have a role to play in delivering on the consumer experience. So for the last year or so, our team has been looking at the role of dumb things in a smart world. And so someone mentioned their adult children, but I said we don't cover humans. We don't do human identity. But so we've been exploring with our community of members, how do we connect products to the smart devices that are actually going to be having those machine interactions with brands and retailers. And so, of course, with the standards behind us, and looking forward to exploring that with all of you a little further today.
Yeah, I'm Gavin, Nicol, CTO at Context Labs. Context Labs is a little bit of an interesting company. We're based in Cambridge here. The two broad areas that are applicable in the context of IoT is we do environmental data analytics, and then we also do supply chain solutions. Or more precisely, we actually do blockchain solutions, and one part of that is supply chain. So on the environmental side, we're actually very interested not only on the environmental data itself, but also sustainability and measuring things like grids and things like that, and how you can actually bring that back to an economic model, which makes sense for actually going out and deploying this stuff. And then on the supply chain stuff, I'll talk a little bit later about some interesting things we did where we kind of backed into a blockchain solution, but it actually ended up being the perfect solution.
Hi, thank you. Peter Mehring with Zest Labs. We're an ag tech solutions company. We manage fresh food from the field all the way to the store or restaurant. And I thought I'd give a little anecdote on what we do. We've been deployed for a couple of years, but we use little sensors like this that get dropped into a pallet of food in the field as it gets packed. And we ask the workers to do two simple things: press a button and drop it in the box. As the products come into the pack houses and the processing plants, we have to detect, did they do those two things? They usually come in as a group of pallets, come on in a truck, and 6, 8, 14 pallets. So what we do a little data conditioning, and this is part of the area, is we look at the group of pallets and say, well, we know we could read that through our sensors wirelessly, we could read 10 pallets came in, but we can see only 9 buttons were pressed. So we fill in the blanks for people to say, we know the sequence, we know how long it takes, we can see the sequence of pallets coming in and one spot's missing, we'll fill in the blank. Or the temperature's too high, they left the tag on the top. They had 2 things to do, right? And they didn't do both. So we can detect it right away, and so data integrity and data validation is an important part of making any solution work. And we've learned over the years that every step of the way, we have to check the data to say it's within the bounds of what we expect, but it's also within the bounds of the group that it's associated with for that process step. So I thought it was an interesting way to look at data as it comes in a tsunami, break it down and look at it as small groups and condition it so that it doesn't become a nuisance to people to manage themselves.
Hi, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. My name is John Licciardello, and I'm Managing Director at the IOTA Foundation. The IOTA Foundation is the organization behind the distributed ledger technology IOTA, which is based on something called the Tangle. You can think of it like Bitcoin is the blockchain, what IOTA is to the Tangle. In a blockchain, as many of you probably know, miners are incentivized to add the next block to the chain with block rewards and transaction fees. Which miner gets to add the next block is determined by a fair and decentralized lottery-like system known as proof of work. But there's a couple problems with blockchain, even though it was an incredibly innovative idea for a set of nodes to trustlessly come to consensus on some set of data. In the case of Bitcoin, it was transaction data. It's slow and it's costly, and these things are by design. It's costly because the transaction fees and the block rewards are what incentivizes the miners to do the proof of work to maintain the ledger. It's slow because that's how consensus is ultimately achieved. In the Tangle, it works very differently. Instead, there are no miners, there are no blocks or chains. Every user has an equal role and responsibility in a network. To issue a transaction with IOTA, you have to approve 2 previous transactions, which in turn prove 2 previous transactions, and so on. This creates what's known as a directed acyclic graph, or DAG for short. And it has some inherent advantages. One, because there's no miners, there's no transaction fees. And also it scales. The more users, the more transactions, the more validations. So it's all about the machine economy, having a trustless and permissionless set of nodes to be able to come to consensus on something. It could be transaction data, it could just be any arbitrary set of data. But to be able to do this, you need to be able to do it in a scalable and costless way, and that's what the IOTA Foundation has been working on.
Hi, I'm Dennis Groseclose. I am the founder of a company called TransVoyant. You all know there's a clock right here, so I'm at the end, and I have to go faster to compress or go longer. So. TransVoyant was founded in 2012. Our primary objective is to use this tsunami that we're talking about today to help Fortune 250, 500 companies manage real-time and predictive supply chain. So we stream in, I'll do more of an Internet of Things kind of thing. We stream in about 700 or 800 live streams all the time at ourselves. And we help companies with supply chains insights, right? What is the current and future behavior of my nodes, my routes, my lanes, my warehouses, my factories, my shop floors? So we're kind of turning it from looking backwards, and when you're doing, remember old ERP and advanced planning and scheduling, we're using data around the company, ecosystem data, their carriers, their ports, their airports, data around that, like external data, right, weather and things like that, plus their inside data. We stream it ourselves and provide insights back to them as a subscription. So I'm also here to tell you all the mistakes a founder makes for 6 years. So if you have any questions about that, I'm pretty good at that part too. And we're back on track. So thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thanks, panelists, for the brief introductions. So Dennis, you get to go first now this time. So you have to be less mindful of the clock. No, but I think it's an interesting point you made about IoT. I'd love to hear. So there's a lot of discussion around IoT use cases, and maybe the panelists can speak to your favorite IoT use case, if you will, if there is one. Stick to one. No, just kidding. But really, the question is, how has the technological evolution really impacted that use case? If as you guys have been playing with that, and then there was discussion earlier about edge and cloud and stuff like that. So data is being generated, we know, but when you process the data and where you process the data and how you process the data, there might be factors influencing those things. So I'd love to get your thoughts on
favorite use case? You want favorite use case? Or?
Favorite use case and where the processing is done, how and why you decided to do it that way.
Mistakes or how and why. So we started the company, then we thought, well, we'll build this platform. It'll all be API driven. Anybody can, in fact, I think Schneider was an early POC customer.
Mistake, right?
Yeah, anybody can use this thing to do any analytics they want, and it turns out unless you put the use cases and the value on top of it, right now, we have about 35 Fortune 500 and bigger customers. They still struggle with, what do I do with all this stuff? So some of our early use cases were really around right place, right time, predicting arrival times, predicting the behavior of nodes and lanes. When I say behavior, I mean current variability, current performance, so that they can optimize inventory levels, right? So they can optimize how order fulfillment, service levels, and drive transportation cost out in the future. And so to your point, we couldn't. I've been a supply chain guy for a long time. You couldn't do this 15 or 20 years ago. The horizontal scale and the way to stream data at yourself and make sense of it all the time, with or without a customer, is completely different than it was 15 years ago. So that's the big difference. But my comment is figure out something that drives value for a customer and then apply all that data to it.
So what I like about the distributed ledger technology space in general is that it's the fusion of engineering and economics. It's really all about incentives when you talk about distributed ledger technologies, because nobody controls the nodes. They do what they want. Satoshi's great insight was that if you can incentivize honest behavior to secure the network, you can come to consensus on something. So when we're talking about big data and its value, these are really economic questions. And the ability to be able to do micropayments, where I give you a micro piece of data, you give me a micro payment in return. And if you don't, well, I'm out one piece of a microdata. It's basically a means of reducing what's called in economics moral hazard. Who pays who what first, right? Now, when you have these companies who have these enormous sets of data and they want to sell it, right, monetize it, it's hard, right? You have to have a sales team, and then you have to figure out how to give them the data, and then who has the rights to it, and you have to check credit histories. I mean, it's a complicated process. But if you have something that's infinitely divisible, and data is a perfect example, but also energy or computational resources such as bandwidth, CPU, memory, these things are infinitely divisible, right? So that you can basically sell a stream of data in exchange for a stream of micropayments. Anytime you are not paid or one person doesn't commit their end of the bargain, it's okay. You're out one little micropayment. You just cut it off. That's actually that can really transform an economy. It can really transform how people do services. So when you're talking about selling data in streams in exchange for micropayments in streams, now you can sell data to anybody. And the IOTA Foundation has this collaboration initiative called the Data Marketplace, where we're working with a lot of different companies to explore this possibility, the ability to be able to sell micropayments or micro sets of data in exchange for micropayments, and to basically monetize these data streams.
So self-serving, Zest Labs does food, but I was attracted to Zest Labs, this was many years ago, based on the amount of food waste. We more than a third of all of our fresh food that we buy is wasted. I mean, it's harvested, is wasted before it gets to consumers. Huge amount of waste. Many of us are from engineering backgrounds. That's terrible yield, right? I mean, that should bother most of us. In trying to solve the problem, the use case became, here's an industry in agriculture that really doesn't monitor its own processes. It doesn't have Six Sigma, it doesn't have a Deming process. And using IoT as a way to get visibility into that all the way to the field and through processes that they're not going to upgrade the equipment. But how do you make that equipment smart? Well, you put sensors in the products. And you have to do it in a low-cost, simple way. The use case is just, it can transform an industry in agriculture, is to say, do everything you did, but now we can give you insights because we're watching as the product goes through your process, how you can do it better. And we can then avoid the waste and not just repurpose it or recycle it. And so I think it's compelling in the sense that it's changing an industry in agriculture.
So the visibility adds to your efficiency.
You do both. You empower the workers to make better decisions, but you also optimize the efficiency of using the equipment, of using your processes. Right. So you really get two strong benefits right away.
Big impact.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for Context Labs, I'll talk about one solution that we ended up doing, and I think it's good because it's illustrative of an IoT use case, which is somewhat atypical, but very prosaic. And we actually started off with the largest printer in the world sitting down and saying, like, okay, how can you reuse your digital content and to monetize the assets that they had? And one part of that ended up, we started looking at things like identity solutions and DRM solutions and things like that. And then we stumbled across the use case, which is for textbooks. There's a massive piracy problem on textbooks, right? This is something which costs them about $20 million a year for Pearson and these kind of people. And you sit down and say, like, okay, well, this is an interesting use case. And for supply chain, how do you get visibility into that? And something like a textbook, you can't put a sensor into it. So what can you do with a textbook to shine a light into the supply chain? So what we came up with was the idea of serializing every textbook by registering the textbook onto a blockchain solution, which actually smells very much like IOTA at the end of the day, that we built because there was nothing that was scalable enough at the time. And in that case, we actually serialized all of these books, and we could scan them in the factory at a couple of steps along the factory, and then also at the consumer level. And just with those bits of data alone, we could figure out if it was counterfeit or if it had been pirated, and if it had been pirated, where it had been pirated. And then there was one other thing that came out of this, and this ties into the economic incentives, is that if you actually put like a cryptographic identifier on every one of these books, that allows you to set up like a shared secret with the consumer if the consumer is engaged with an app. And then they have an incentive to come online and then get into, say, an online asset or something like that. They're based on the digital, on the shared secret. And now the publishers suddenly have the ability to reach the consumer, which ordinarily they wouldn't have had, because they would have ordinarily given the books to Amazon or somebody like that. Amazon would have sold them, and at that point it's a complete black hole. And just by scanning this data and giving somebody an incentive at either end, you not only supply light into the supply chain, but you can actually enable the publishers to have a direct connection with their consumer. And I think that's really illustrative of a lot of the kind of very unusual use cases you can come up with. Not strictly blockchain per se, but the ability to kind of like embed a little bit of smarts into the supply chain. It's a great case. And Zest is doing the same thing all throughout the steps. So I love that too.
Yeah, lots of different use cases there. Melanie, maybe you can, with your background, there's a lot of flavors here, but maybe there is a role for standards that you work with that can add more efficiency, more interoperability, all that stuff. So could you shed some light as what role standards have to play in this fast evolving space?
Definitely. It's everything they said. Well, thinking about industrial and consumer Internet of Things applications, right? Traceability became sort of a principal foundation that you have to have identification of the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why, right? If you're not identifying things, it doesn't matter what technology you put behind it, it doesn't matter what sensors you put into a product or a device, you're never gonna get any value out of the data. And we're very relationship-based, right? So that continuum of a product as it moves through a supply chain and extending that into the consumer's home, right? Driving consumer choice, driving open ecosystems, that's what standards are all about. So we try to build a data model built on the foundation of persistent, globally unique identity, which can now be embedded into technologies we didn't have. When the 1D barcode was invented, you didn't have the notion of NFC or UHF or, right, complex sensors. Now that we have those things and we drove some B2B use cases around inventory accuracy and bricks and mortar, you can extend that into the home by persisting that identifier, allowing for some things that were talked about earlier today with security and privacy and customer opt-in, but to allow a brand and a retailer to continue that conversation in the home really relies on all the parties being able to exchange information seamlessly. So certainly in the digital traceability context at the supply chain level, and getting very granular with the data as well. And so standards which, think about electronic data interchange, which we've been supporting underneath ANSI for many years in the US, and of course the UN CFAX standard outside. You started there very batch-oriented, but huge volumes, so lots of scale, but you couldn't get prescriptive, and now you can, and so you've seen serialization, like you were talking about, is now to the unit level, to where that individual consumer post-purchase can have an engagement with the product as well. And so that's really the role I think standards have, is to continue to drive the notion of open ecosystems and democratization, I think for all the business parties involved, but as well for the consumers that want to participate in a more highly connected world.
Excellent. Identity is key, both from a access point of view, from a transaction point of view, and all the privacy issues.
The person, the device, the product.
Exactly, it scans.
And then the relationship of all of them together.
Yeah, fantastic. So just want to remind folks, like Mark said, we have the opportunity for you guys to chime in with your questions. So there are folks, volunteers, who can hand you guys cards, and we'd love to bring in those questions to these panelists. So raise your hand or look for your volunteer. We talked a lot about data. Let's get into a little bit about data. As we all know, in its raw format is not necessarily usable as is, right? And you could do a lot of things to make sure that the raw format itself is high fidelity or whatever. But then, we know that the cost of storage is falling. We know, ubiquitous computing and all that is making analytics cheaper. But the total use cost of data, whether it's data preparation, moving data to the right place, all of those things are where the costs are. So you guys are all handling a lot of data. So could maybe starting from Gavin, can you sort of comment on what sorts of investments you're making in preparing data for the Holy Grail analytics, machine learning, whatever have you, insight, right?
Well, that's a very broad question.
Right, but
because there's a lot of bits in there. But I think fundamentally, I think, and this is probably echoes right throughout this entire panel that I've heard, is that one of the things at IoT and with the larger streams of data that comes in, that it changes your perspective on how you do it. So rather than thinking about okay, I've got to shuffle all this data into a big relational database and then run large queries on it, I think right now the world is moving to a world where basically most of the stuff we're looking at, and this is where a blockchain comes in, is you look at everything as an event stream, as an immutable event stream, and as it comes down there, you actually put processes on that and then build views up on top of it. And that's kind of the approach that we take when we look at these things from an analytical perspective, is rather than trying to analyze the raw stream, we like to capture it because it's good for doing retrospective analysis. But through the processing pipeline, what we try to do is actually build a stack of views, if you will, and derive views on that data that is updated in real time or semi-real time. And I think you've seen that emerge, that particular architecture emerge not only in the IoT space, but if you go over into, say, for example, looking at Facebook and LinkedIn, all these other large-scale companies, ad tech companies, everyone is moving that way because that's the only way that you can deal with the data of that volume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd agree, and we look at it in the same way, that we look at the value of the data in really two separate forms. One is the streaming portion, and that's the event-driven, take actions in real time to prevent food loss, but then we also look at it as we capture the data, and we charge a subscription for that based on how they handle the food. But then we also look at what can we do for trending analysis afterwards. So when you look at data storage, we offset that cost with the trend analysis. We look at the bandwidth, and the data collection is offset by the subscription and the streaming. And so the business model and the price model have to fit the value model for both pieces. And so if we're going to store the data for a couple of years because we want to look season-to-season trends, there has to be value there. So I think just matching that is an opportunity that when you look at it, what's your cost? Well, what value you're deriving, and then how do you do, and the costs are dropping. But it's in addition to storage and computation for all the cloud and the real-time event-driven logic that we run, there's also the bandwidth to get from all over, pull the data streams in.
Right. Yeah, go ahead. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we treat, first off, it's important, I think, to understand our customers, the actual real, end customer in our world, they don't really care how much data you have and where it's streaming and how many views you have and how you heal it and normalize it and put spatial or temporal attributes against it. They care about the answer or the prediction you're giving them. So but then if you look at how our company is built, I'd tell you 70% of our technical resources work on the inbound supply chain, data supply chain, and the factory, the analytics platform that produces the insights. So we spend a lot of time and money. We buy data. We source data. We heal it as it comes in. We do actually run some analytics on the stream so that we can fix them if there are problems with them. We do keep the original as well for provenance. And so at the end of the day, when you're actually servicing the customer, all they care is your prediction right about when my stuff's going to arrive? Was your telling me not to ship through that airport, was that correct? To do that, it takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of IoT data streams. But you got to keep the end in mind when you're putting together your stack or your platform is what I'd add to it. So go ahead.
Go ahead. I would just follow up. So you were talking about bandwidth. It's a fundamental reality of our world that the spectrum is finite, right? There is only so much of it that, unless we want to live in a microwave, we have to stop at some point. So how do we share effectively that bandwidth? How do we efficiently allocate a scarce resource, right? That's what it's about. That's back to the economics question. And IOTA at its core is just a protocol. It's just a way of communicating in a trustless world, right? Where you have all these devices, you don't know which device is hacked or malicious or just not working properly or is offline, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have a way to be able to trustlessly basically exchange data and value and share resources. So when we're talking about bandwidth especially, the other like CPU and memory, they get smaller and there's got plenty of it. The bandwidth is not that. We see we've gone from 3G to 4G, now we're 5G. It's going to run out. Eventually, there's just not going to be enough room to exchange all the data that these devices will use and depend on. So we're going to need a way for them to be able to share this finite resource and allocate that finite spectrum efficiently.
Yeah. No, so yeah. Thanks for that insight. I think technology barriers, do exist, and I think innovation is going to assist there. But when we talk about data, it's imperative that we also. There's a lot of discussion about marketplaces and open data platforms and stuff like that. It's imperative that you open up the data for a broader ecosystem to contribute to the analytics because you can't all do it alone. And so maybe starting with John, can you comment on the feasibility and what ingredients are essential for a data marketplace, right? There's a data valuation, but there's also an enabling technology. And the concept itself of data marketplace as we go into a more data-driven economy is going to be quite important. So very quickly, maybe folks who have comments on that.
Sure. So, if you look at the world's 5 most valuable companies, right? It's Alphabet, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. They're all primarily in the business of collecting, storing, and selling data. But who owns the data really, right? When I go to Facebook, is that my data? Is that Facebook's data? And if they start selling it to somebody like Cambridge Analytica, is that okay? So I think you kind of need a fundamental rethinking about who owns the data at the end of the day. And in my personal opinion, I think the people who produce the data own the data. It's their data. And they're free to sell it if they want. And Facebook can facilitate that sale and take a margin. That's fine too, right? It's through their platform. But if you enable users to basically monetize their own data, now you have a real data marketplace where people are basically put back in charge of the data that they produce. They can monetize it for themselves. And then it's also helpful for these companies because they absolve themselves of any responsibility of what happens to that data because they sold it for themselves. You know, they got paid for it. It's their choice. So I think it's important to kind of rethink, you know, who does the data really belong to, and allow people who produce that data to be in charge of where it goes.
I think, I just want to piggyback on that for 1 second, because I think we also have to look at alternative sources for data creation. In supply chain in particular, certain people think that they own all data creation and all conversations. And when you talk about decentralization and democratization, your data sources are going to come from places you never thought it could before. So how do we, right, leveraging some of these technologies, allow for more crowdsourcing around valuable data experiences that I think are actually going to benefit all of us? It's a tough conversation. It's a tough conversation to have with supply chain practitioners who are, right, it's about my four walls, and it's a trust environment today, right? You and I engage in a trading partnership. We're talking about trustless environments and crowdsourcing of data. I think that's going to create unique marketplace opportunities, but also give for incumbent B2B players some really interesting use cases about how to better leverage data.
Yeah, and to Peter's point, I mean, they want to see value, otherwise they're not investing in that data, and you know, not all data has equal value. So I think having an opportunity to somehow identify the quality of the data, the applicability of the data, and then going back to my discussion about a marketplace where this information can be openly shared, reliably be consumed, and then consume that data. All right. Any other comments on that before I have another follow-up question?
Yeah, I was just going to comment, because one of the other things that we actually spend quite a lot of time on is doing what we call data veracity.
Sure.
Which is trying to ensure that the data is trustworthy, right? And I think, you know, you can go out and pretty simplistically say like, okay, hey, we can do proof of existence and things like that. But ultimately, I think, you know, the notion of trustless networks as such really doesn't exist, because at the end of the day, you have to put trust into that network some way. And so what we do when we do data veracity is we actually do things like multi-point proofs and things like that, and attestation networks and things like that on top of it. And you can think about, you know, creating kind of like an economic models around that, which actually allows people basically to create curation channels and stuff like that, and to get incentivized for creating the clean data. And that will only solve part of the problem, though, because, you know, you still end up with fake data, and how do you capture that? And ultimately, those trust relationships between all the entities within those networks, they evolve over time, you know. So I think there's a big conversation that has to be had around this, and that may tie into standards around governance, right? Because there's a technical component to this, but there's an absolute social component to this too. You know, we have to recognize that and really deal with that first, I think.
Yeah, and Dennis pointed to the provenance as well, right? I mean, to be able to trace the data all the way to its origin requires a way by which standards can play a role as well, is to, you know, how do you tag the provenance, how do you tag the metadata, and, you know, the person tagging the metadata, is he a trusted party or not, you know, and who trusts him, and so it's a fascinating space to be in. But, you know, the next extrapolation of that thought is, there's also mention about GDPR and data privacy and all of that stuff, right? So yes, you have my data, but do you really have the right to use the data? And do you have the right to use the data, you know, any way you want, or are there constraints in terms of how you can use my data, and what can you do after you use the data? And what do you do on top of the data that you derive based on my data? Because now that data's ownership is not clear. Who owns that data? So you guys live in this world. So and the regulatory space is fast evolving. You know, Europe is leading the way, but there's a lot of countries that are kind of building regulation. How do you guys see that as a threat or opportunity, or how do you plan to take advantage? I always look at it from the positive side, take advantage of the opportunity in terms of the regulatory changes.
You guys looking at me?
I'll take a cut at it.
Go
I
ahead,
mean,
Peter.
so
I'll go second.
supply chain is probably one of the cleaner divisions, even though a lot of people think they own the data. You're tracking a product, and the product, who owns the product is a good reflection of who should own the data at that time. That said, there's constant overlap with if I have food and it's grown by a farmer, goes to a commercial processor and gets handed off, ownership isn't always exactly changing hands, and third-party logistics companies manage the transportation but don't own the product, so it adds complexity. The one example that has really the food industry struggled with is end-to-end traceability for food recalls, number one, but also for information for the consumer. And everyone wants to benefit in it, but then the question is, how do you share that data ownership? And so what we've pushed back to the people is there has to be equal value. If everyone's going to share the data, they need to get value out of it. And the initial traceability initiatives there were really targeted at the consumer or retailer, but no value for the suppliers. We found a way to get equal value to all of it, and it gets people to participate on a daily basis, an operational basis. So the data is now available, it's validated, and we can then get the value of the end-to-end traceability when needed, because it's not always needed. But so there's really two layers, actually there's many layers, but two distinct layers for group ownership and then individual ownership. And then there's obviously complexities with 3PLs. But again, we always look back to what value is derived, and then you get the shared ownership. But you have to, I think, define that first, and some of the early traceability initiatives, I think, failed to do that, where today I think it's better known.
Okay. Anyone else wants to comment on that?
Probably because it's fresh in my mind. First off, it's really you got to start with what your business is and the business model and what you're trying to do for customers, right? So from the day one, we realized that we need to come to the EU standards because we wanted to be a global company, and now we have customers all over the world. To do that, we did all the tech work. We literally had quarterly reviews with lawyers and architects designing PII, privacy, proprietary information policy into the system or the platform. So there's this whole technical thing that you need to align with where regulation and information policy is going so that you can control data at the atomic level. So I can see 3 data elements on a document and you can see 5, right? And that's the first thing I would say. I firmly believe, and if anybody knows my background, it's through the School of Hard Knocks, that the generator of the data owns it. So we pay for all of our data. Our biggest bill is data from in-streaming data, by far. I have people too, but data's pretty big. And we also have decided as a business not to focus on people who own the product, right? They make it or they sell it. And we don't get in the middle of all these other intermediaries, right? So if we want data from a carrier, for example, we buy it from them, right? And that business, in the United States, that doesn't happen. There's whole companies built on business models of scraping data and all. You go to Europe and you try to track a truck or a plane or something, they're gonna say, I own the data, what do I get in return, right? And how are you gonna protect it? So I would start with what's your business and your business model, and bring. I hate lawyers. Mm-hmm. Sorry if you are one. Mm-hmm. Bring your lawyer guys in to help you with design sessions every once in a while, not every sprint, but every once in a while. That's my ad. She's waving at the clock. I was her in.
Yeah.
I'll just add one very quick thing to that, which is I don't think the technology is really there to enforce the guarantees that everybody wants. So I think the legal side of it is actually really crucial, yeah?
Super. Well, thanks, guys. So we've got a few questions, thanks, Bill, that I'd like to take in from the audience point of view. How does unstructured data, for example, voice, video streams, impact IoT data-based business? So versus structured, where it's probably easier for you to expect the structure, unstructured, you got to format, invest in interpreting. So how does it apply to any of your specific businesses?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
So it's another stream, and so my answer is yes, it impacts it. You start with what you're trying to do, right? So we're not driving ad tech and all these other things. We're driving what's happening in my supply chain 3 days from now. So a lot of unstructured data comes in that helps us with that, right? News information, streaming text data from television. And what are we really doing? We're only looking for possible disruptions at a port, right? And that's an important aspect of how you have to build up your analytics. You know, we get a lot of data science comes in, they're going to write one big model and that's going to solve the world. It doesn't work that way, right? We have 60, 70 little models that build on each other that produce a time of arrival. In there's 1 or 2 that are streaming in unstructured data, listening for port problems in Japan, right? And that's just one aspect of the buildup of the answer. So we use it. We put structure on it, but that's a whole different, I don't have enough time to talk about that.
Right. Anyone else getting impacted by unstructured data?
I was just going to comment. So that approach, I think, is just the general one, right? Is that if you have unstructured data, the answer is how do you extract some signals out of that and turn it into structured data that you can ingest somewhere else, and how do you make that whole thing flexible? Yeah?
Okay. Another question here is, so is IoT sort of a equalizer in terms of allowing low-tech companies to leapfrog ahead of the more deep pocket enterprises in ways by which new innovative means of doing business, just down to basics or whatever, but low-tech small SMEs can get ahead of the enterprise?
Well, I think allowing anyone to monetize data, I think does at least give a leg up to the low-tech companies. Obviously, right now, the big enterprises are the aggregators of the massive amounts of most data that their clouds are absolutely ginormous. But in the low-tech space, in fact, my job at the IOTA Foundation is to look at projects that are being built on the IOTA core protocol. And what you see a lot of is various types of devices, new types of projects that really wouldn't be enabled unless they could sell their data to anybody on this kind of data marketplace exchange type of scenario, because it's very hard to find buyers for your data sometimes, right? And then once you do find a buyer, how do you actually facilitate that sale? But with a decentralized technology, it's quite simple. You just broadcast a message saying, I have this data, this is its attributes, pay me to this address, and I will make a transaction with the data encrypted with your public key so that only you can decrypt it. And as long as you keep paying me that data, that micro payment stream, I will keep providing you that data.
Yeah, I mean, weather data is a perfect example where they have a lot of distributed weather sort of sensors across tens of thousands of people's homes, and the only person that has data is me because it's in my backyard. So now suddenly it allows me an opportunity to be a part of the ecosystem. Melanie, there's a question targeted to you, which is, can you share some specific examples of consumer IoT that standards are impacting, and how GS1 is helping in that space?
Sure. I think the current focus is around in-home replenishment, right? So being able to leverage smart pantry, smart trash can to get consumer products delivered into my home. And the important thing there, right, when we think about GS1 membership all over the world, it's people who manufacture consumer products and people who are at the other end of that supply chain for those products. And so most of the use cases historically started out of a B2B, I want to be able to track things from factory to store, and quickly has become, I need to serialize those things because I can only drive effective inventory accuracy if I have down to the unit level serialization. Omnichannel really drove RFID adoption. And so now extending that to the consumer was, now how do I, as a brand owner, get a connection to that consumer? So the consumer wants transparency, but what I want is relationship. So bring that into the home, drive replenishment, also warranty, recall, kind of building on the whole food safety notion, being able to get very precise about recall so that we don't have to pull the entire American spinach inventory off of the shelf when we know that it was one farm one day. So increasing trust with consumers, I think, is a big component. So for standards, our role, right, is to create a data model that allows the planetary scale we need for these products to interact with devices, and then the information sharing. And as some of you guys have touched on that before, it's less about technology for a standards organization, and it's much more about a common language, so that as we're transacting all of this data between these parties, it can happen in a seamless and scalable way. And that's the interesting nature of being a standards organization. You're usually the last group that people will come to because they all want to go build a market, right, and build competitive differentiation. Then unfortunately they find it's very expensive and we can't get the scale that we want. So they come to GS1 and say, right, let's find a way to do this in broad scale.
And how about encryption or consumer privacy? If I want to use an IoT device that helps me, gets value for me, but I want to protect my privacy. I don't. Maybe it's food is a special case where I want to hear about the recall, but some cases I don't want to necessarily have the company identify me as a consumer. So there's a sort of a delicate balance between benefits and being able to be identified versus my privacy. So is the standards evolving doing anything in the encryption or identity protection point of view?
Well, keeping in mind that we focus on data standards, right? So we take into account what others are doing in the privacy and security space. I think you'll always hear us talk about opt-in, right? Explicit opt-in, I think, as being critical. But as we did work in UHF, one of our big components was public policy, privacy, right? Kind of that impact awareness, making sure consumers understand what they might be opting into. And so our role is really to partner with other standards organizations and policymakers. We spend a lot of time working with different agencies around where their interests at the consumer level, because we're much more involved with the businesses that are reaching out to these consumers. How do all of those things tie together? So for us, partnership with standards orgs and partnerships with technology, because I think these guys are probably going to solve for security and privacy much quicker than we would be able to do it.
Any specific example of a standards body comes to mind that GS1 is working with?
Well, not from security and privacy, but certainly we work with ISO, with IEEE, right? There are no shortage of standards organizations, and we also work with a lot of trade associations in the U.S. in particular. Consumer Goods Forum and Global Food Safety Initiative. We have a lot of work with GFSI. So
yeah.
I think on the consumer side, there's a lot of activity, especially in Europe, and there's a lot of groups like Sovereign and people like that who are very focused on self-sovereign identity. And the one thing which comes out of that for me, which is kind of interesting, is the ability to decouple your own personal identity from the cryptographic identity that you expose to somebody else, and being able to expose multiple cryptographic identities to provide a certain degree of information hiding.
Yeah.
So, those kind of standards are nascent, and eventually they'll end up on your desk.
Yeah.
I've heard that described as having like a P.O. box instead of a home address. Yeah. So you can go get incoming information, exchange information in the same way. But yeah, you're right. I see it more in Europe discussions than here in the U.S.
Yeah. This question that came in to have you guys elaborate on the GDPR from EU. And does anyone have specific comments on how IoT is being impacted from that?
I think
IoT data per se.
There's a lot of, I first always step back and think about like the ethical and moral standpoint. And it's actually a really tough question, especially in this DLT space that I work in. There was recently a controversy about what image may or may not have been uploaded to the Bitcoin blockchain. Whether it was or not is irrelevant, because the fact is it could be. And who's responsible for that? Who if everybody's responsible in a sense, is anyone responsible? Also, when you're talking about personal data, is a hash of somebody's personal data still their data? Like, what happens if you delete the original file? Does that still count? You can't really reproduce the original file from the hash, of course. So, I mean, these are tough questions. They're really hard to kind of find answers to, and especially in the space that I work in, where when you upload kind of a data to the blockchain, for example, it's immutable. You can't really get it out of there. And if you think about all of the kind of nefarious things that could be uploaded, like WMD instructions or other horrible, sinister things. I mean, these are kind of scary realities that we kind of have to grapple with, and I don't really have good answers for them.
Yeah.
So GDPR, if you print it out in kind of big text, because I'm blind, the document's about that thick. The first half of it is a bunch of comments. It's crazy. It's worse than Congress. The second half of it's long-winded stuff. If you actually read it, it's not a technical problem. This is not a technical problem. This is a policy and what kind of business are you running and use case problem. And we're compliant. I mean, we got, and it's not easy. I'm not trying to make light of it, but this is not a technical issue, and I'll stand behind that. This is a how do you run your business? How do you believe data is owned by the source? Do you compensate? Not necessarily compensate. Do you handle it correctly? Is there redress? Right. It's big and ugly, and the lawyers are making a bunch of money telling you that you can talk to them, and that's cool. You do. But it's a policy, and it's a use case kind of problem. It's not technically, you can do it.
It's a little different in my world, at least, because we're not a business. We're the Bitcoin. There's no Bitcoin company. It's who owns Bitcoin? I don't know. Everybody. Who controls Bitcoin? Nobody. So it's not the type of thing where, of course, when you are a business, you do control your own, what you store and
or you process on behalf of somebody. So
right.
you got to deal with two issues, and we won't have enough time to talk about that.
Right. But
Bill was waiting for me when I was going to be a heretic, so I'm going to throw one more heretic thing on the fire. I would love there to be standards, right? But if you're building a big streaming analytics platform, and I'll join the club, right? But if you're building a big streaming analytics platform that's going to work, let's say supply chain and figuring out behavior across all modes around the globe, assume there's not standards, okay? You build a system where you can, through your stream integration, can normalize data for yourself until the standards catch up, because it's the Wild West when you go global. So
yeah.
I was going to add one comment to this, which is, I would say that to the degree that technology doesn't mirror the social structures around the technology, it's a failure. So that's one of the things that you quite often see is people will go out and say, like, oh, blockchain is going to solve all of your problems. And it's like, okay, well, not everybody needs to know that I bought a stick of gum,
Super. Thanks a lot, guys. It's been fascinating talking about the various aspects of leveraging IoT data. You guys brought a lot of different perspectives. We have several questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. If the panelists have comments, we'll try to put them together and find a way to share their comments. If you have additional questions, feel free to push them out.